Descartes. Rene Descartes looked something like one of the Three Musketeers. He had long wavy hair to his shoulders, a mustache, a neatly trimmed beard, and always wore a sword dangling by his side. But the image was not the man. Although he did join the army once, he never saw a battle and spent his time thinking instead. Descartes' real field was the field of the mind, and there he saw plenty of action. Within that mind, he battled against ignorance and tradition, and rose to the ranks of heroism as the greatest philosopher of the 17th century, and one of the most influential thinkers of all time. Descartes, who's called the founder of modern French rationalism, is perhaps most famous for his declaration, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. But there's another comment, one that better defines who he was and what motivated him. It was his statement that there is nothing so far removed from us as to be beyond our reach, or so hidden that we cannot discover it. Descartes was more than a philosopher. He was also a gifted mathematician who invented, among other things, analytic geometry and expanded algebra. But in spite of his mathematical genius, it was his writings and ideas in philosophy that gained him immortality. His greatest achievement is that he's considered the first philosopher to clearly show the difference between mind and matter. He developed a system of philosophical thought that divided the world into two realms, the non-material, or God, and the material, or physical. He held that reason and science could only be applied to the material world, and that problems of theology and politics, or church and state, were not to be investigated. This way he helped introduce the age of reason and science, without threatening the political and social structure of 17th century France. This delicate balance was upset later when English philosophy, led by Isaac Newton and John Locke, was imported to France and became a basis for examining French society, particularly the monarchy and the church. But until that happened, Descartes was the prominent voice in French philosophy. To understand the context of his thoughts, it's important to know something of the time in which Descartes lived, which were the years between 1596 and 1650. He was born in France, but spent much of his life in the Netherlands. 17th century Europe was an age of conflict and contradictions. It was a time when science was becoming more popular and religions were becoming less tolerant. Society was beginning to place its confidence both in reason and in religious authorities, two sources that didn't always blend very well. In many ways, the 17th century was the first modern century. Although there was still a wealthy aristocracy ruling over a mass of miserably poor, there was also the beginnings of a middle class, made up mostly of merchants. Capitalism and material progress were becoming evident, and so people's thoughts turned from classical traditions to the practical needs of daily life. This was also a violent chapter of history, with many wars and revolts and much cruelty. But it also had an abundance of creative geniuses in every field. Shakespeare, Donne, Milton, and Cervantes in literature. Spinoza, Bacon, Locke, and Berkeley in philosophy. Velázquez, Rubens, and Rembrandt in art. And Galileo, Kepler, and Harvey in science. Alongside this genius and creativity was corruption and debauchery. Morals were lax, to say the least, and a gross sensuality seemed to pervade the entire continent. One of the strong values people did hold, at least in the upper class, was that of personal honor. Duels were so frequent in France at this time that the king tried to prohibit the practice. But this was an age of action and combat, and people were not to be deterred. Descartes was not the only one who carried a sword at all times. Most people felt they lived in an atmosphere of constant danger and unpredictability. Armed bands of mercenaries roamed Europe looking for employment, and when they couldn't find any, they resorted to robbery. There was continual war between Catholics and Protestants, and both religions allowed their princes to terrorize the civilian population. As a result, neither was very popular with the peasants. In spite of a rising middle class and capitalism, the Europe of Descartes was still mostly rural and agricultural. There were only 14 cities in Europe that could be called large, that is, with populations over 100,000. Most city dwellers lived in poverty, filth, and squalor, just as they had since medieval times. People living in the country fared little better. 1/3 of the residents who lived in Germany when Descartes was born were dead 48 years later, from famine, disease, massacre, and war. In his earlier days, Descartes was often involved in the politics of his times, politics which were based mostly on war. Louis XIII was King of France, and his Minister of State was Cardinal Richelieu, the man who was the real power behind the throne. A 30-year war was waging between the Catholic rulers of Spain and Austria and the Protestant rulers of Germany, Sweden, and Denmark. Richelieu played off both sides, hoping to continue the war until everybody was so weak that France could step in and take over leadership of Europe. Descartes served in the army in the early stages of this war. France was a Catholic nation, and to Richelieu, the cause of Catholicism and France were one cause. He attacked the Protestant minority in France, resulting in the famous siege of La Rochelle, and succeeded in defeating them. Descartes took part in this offensive as an advisor. Richelieu was successful in this strategy of promoting the 30 Years' War. By the middle of the 17th century, Spain, Austria, and their Catholic rulers were secondary powers in Europe. France was a leader, but shared its lead with England and the Netherlands. All the organized religions in Europe, Catholic, Protestant, Lutheran, Calvinist, and Anglican, were guilty of horrible tortures and atrocities in the name of their God. Hundreds of victims were burned alive for their alleged heresy. There was only one country that allowed religious freedom, and that was the Netherlands, where the state controlled the church. It was here that Descartes chose to spend his last 20 years. In the Netherlands, although his ideas were severely criticized, he was able to write in freedom. These are the times that gave birth to one of the greatest philosophers and thinkers of history, and his life both reflected and departed from the trends and social currents of his days. Rene Descartes was born March 31, 1596, in the small village of La Haye in the province of Touraine, France. His father was a physician, and his mother was the daughter of a prominent lawyer. She died only 2 days after his birth, and the infant Rene, fragile and suffering from tuberculosis, was not expected to live much longer. He recovered, but remained a weak and frail child. Descartes' father moved to Brittany, where he remarried. He met with great success and fortune in his career, and rose to the ranks of the nobility. Descartes was always proud of his family position, but more importantly, the wealth his father left him allowed him to pursue his philosophy and studies unfettered by financial concerns. Even as a child, it was apparent he was destined to live the life of a scholar and thinker. He had such an inquisitive mind that his father called him the little philosopher. When Rene was 8 years old, he attended a Jesuit college that was among the best schools for mathematics. It also taught literature, classical languages, history, logic, ethics, and physics, all of which Descartes mastered with ease. He later wrote of his extreme desire to acquire knowledge while at school, and his sense that, as he so modestly put it, he was not inferior to his fellow students. In fact, he was brilliant. At school, he began his lifelong interest in mathematics and his lifelong admiration of the Jesuit order. He was a star pupil and was exempt from the more rigorous regulations of the school because of his health. Due to a chronic cough, he was allowed to remain in bed as long as he wished. It was a habit that stayed with him his whole life. He did much of his studying and writing in bed, something he could easily do since he always lived alone. Although he liked the Jesuits, Descartes would later rebel against the curriculum and philosophy taught in such schools. He felt he'd been given the best education possible at the time, but to him, this wasn't saying much. Descartes felt teachers were simply passing on the opinions of the ancients without any regard for current knowledge, such as mathematics, which to him was the only knowledge that was certain. The lessons in philosophy particularly bothered him. He said shortly after, "Philosophy teaches us to speak with an appearance of truth about all things, and causes us to be admired by the least learned. No single thing is to be found in it which is not a matter of dispute, and which in consequence is not dubious." Mathematics, on the other hand, gave him clarity and certainty. Not only that, but he believed it held the truths of life within it, much as Plato had felt. Descartes said, "I do not accept or desire any other principle in physics than in geometry or abstract mathematics, because all of the phenomena of nature may be explained by their means." In spite of his objections to the education given him by the Jesuits, Descartes always retained devout religious convictions and carefully formed a philosophy which he felt confident violated none of the church beliefs. The church felt differently, as we will soon see. Although the Jesuits were among the last religious groups to attack Descartes' writing, they nevertheless placed him on their index of forbidden books after his death. When he was 17, Descartes went to Paris with the intention of spending 2 years enjoying the social and cultural offerings of the city, and avoiding philosophy altogether. But his own mind would not rest. Instead, he withdrew to a secluded house in order to devote himself to reflection and mathematical investigations. Following that, he went to the University of Poitiers and obtained a doctorate in law. But instead of starting a legal practice, he joined an army in the 30-Year War and went to Holland, refusing to accept any pay, which was just as well. Instead of fighting, he spent the idle winter months pursuing his mathematical studies. From these and later studies in math would develop his unique and valuable contributions to that field. The invention of coordinate geometry, which made it possible to determine the position of a point in a plane by its distance from 2 fixed lines, and his analytical method, by which he first supposed a problem completely solved and then proceeded to analyze the consequences of this hypothesis, thus working backwards, so to speak, from traditional approaches. For his idea of coordinate geometry, Descartes was reportedly inspired by a common housefly. He was lying in bed, as he so often did, and watching the fly buzz around the room when it occurred to him that the fly's position could be described at every moment by locating the 3 perpendicular planes that intersected at the point it occupied. On a 2-dimensional surface, such as paper, every point could be located by the intersection of 2 lines, such as longitude and latitude on a map. Today, this system is known as the Cartesian coordinates, because Descartes used to sign his work with the Latin version of his name, Renatus Cartesius. After his military stint in Holland, Descartes joined the army of Maximilian, Duke of Bavaria, and was probably present during the crucial battle in which Maximilian's Catholic forces defeated the Protestant armies of Germany. According to Descartes, he spent the 10th of November, 1619, in a room of a farmhouse in Germany, in voluntary seclusion, formulating a new approach to philosophy. He told of 3 dreams and visions he'd experienced that revealed to him the fundamentals of his new philosophy, and told him his mission was to seek truth by reason. As a result of these visions, he made a vow to make a pilgrimage to the shrine of Our Lady at Loreto in Italy. The premise that came out of his visions was to apply the methods of mathematics to philosophical questions. His goal was to free himself from all tradition and develop an independent thought system all his own. When he left the army a few years later, Descartes kept his vow and toured Italy, making a pilgrimage on foot from Venice to the shrine of the Virgin of Loreto. While traveling in Europe, he devoted himself to observations of nature and human life. At some point in his travels, he constructed an early type of robot, which he had transported home by sea. But the ship's captain looked into the chest out of curiosity and was horrified when he saw the lifelike form, which moved somehow like an automated being. Thinking it could only be the devil in disguise, he threw the entire chest into the ocean. After his travels, Descartes returned to Paris, just long enough to make arrangements for a permanent move to Holland. Paris was too distracting, and he felt a greater need for solitude and quiet. For the remaining 20 years of his life, he lived in Holland, except the last 5 months, which he spent in Sweden. He never bothered to learn the Dutch language, fearing this would be a threat to the complete social isolation he desired. Descartes never married, but he did have a mistress who gave birth to his daughter Francine in 1634. Descartes adored the child, and when she died only 5 years later, it took him many months to recover. The year before his daughter died, Descartes had completed some of his first writings on philosophy, called Le Monde, or The World. But he abandoned his book immediately when he heard that Galileo had been condemned of heresy. Galileo's book included support of Copernicus' theory that the sun was the center of the universe and not the earth, as the Church maintained. Since Descartes' work also supported Galileo, he felt it best to keep it to himself. Whether he was motivated by loyalty to the Church or fear of its wrath is a matter of interpretation. Instead, he worked out a compromise theory whereby the Earth stood still in the middle of a vortex that traveled around the sun, a theory that was accepted by many until Isaac Newton put everyone straight several years later. In Holland, Descartes moved 24 times, but somehow managed just the same to complete some of his major works. This moving about from house to house was part of a general secrecy he liked to maintain, often disguising his whereabouts and his interests, seldom sharing his genuine thoughts with people, and pretending to be working on nothing, when he was in fact consumed by his work. There have been a whole range of theories about his secrecy. Some believe he was just protecting himself from opposition. Some even claimed he was secretly a member of the Rosicrucians, an international fraternity that practiced an occult philosophy. Most, however, believe he was always a devout Catholic who felt his philosophy reconciled with his faith, and that the goal of his secrecy was to avoid judgment before the work was even completed. He was a self-confident man who saw himself as something of a visionary, and so it made sense to him to go it alone. He did, however, have many distinguished, loyal friends, with whom he kept up a lively correspondence. Descartes lived modestly and was said to have a kindly disposition. He was very generous to his servants and concerned about their welfare, and they in turn were devoted to him. In 1637, when he was 41, Descartes released discourses, of which one discourse, Discourse on Method, was especially celebrated. It was also condemned. Descartes was accused of atheism and skepticism by prominent Protestants who tried to obtain an indictment against him. But influential friends intervened, and the final judgment merely limited all discussion of his philosophy. 4 years after Discourses, he released Meditations, and then Principles of Philosophy. He continued to be accused of heresy by various religious groups, but in later years was recognized as one of the leading philosophers of Europe. Descartes' fame became so great that Queen Christina of Sweden persuaded him to move to her country and become her tutor. It was common in these times for European royalty to fill their courts with intellectuals, and was usually done more from an attempt to appear fashionable than from any burning desire for knowledge. Descartes accepted reluctantly, as well he should have, and she dispatched a royal ship to transport him. It seems Queen Christina was not always a receptive student. When Descartes was trying to explain to her his mechanistic theory, that is, his view that all animals are mechanisms, she responded that she had never seen a watch give birth to baby watches. The larger problem, however, was not his pupil's aptitude, but the Swedish climate and the severe working conditions imposed on him by the eccentric queen. He was obliged to instruct her at 5 o'clock in the morning in her draughty castle, even in the bitter cold of winter. It proved too much for his delicate lungs, and he came down with pneumonia. Descartes died 11 days after becoming ill on February 11, 1650, at the age of 54. He had been in Sweden barely 5 months. His body was returned to Paris, except the head, which for some reason was left in Sweden and had to be reclaimed later by his friends. His funeral went on, head or no head, and was interrupted by a court order forbidding the delivery of a eulogy. This was the beginning of Catholic opposition to his philosophy, which climaxed in 1663 when his books were banned. He was a threat to Catholicism because he insisted that doubt was essential in finding the truth, and doubt, to the Church, was in direct conflict with faith. Yet even while theologians were railing against him, he was gaining popularity in the court and the fashionable salons of Paris, where his ideas were a source of lively conversation and debate. In time, his insistence on rational evidence and his demand for remaining doubtful in the absence of this evidence would become the foundation for modern research and science. Although Descartes made errors in his own scientific conclusions, for example, he rejected the existence of atoms, didn't believe in the existence of a vacuum, thought the planets moved in a circular rather than elliptical pattern, and denied the theory of gravity, his methods for attaining truth contributed enormously to the future growth of science. His chief contribution was his method of doubting all prior conclusions, accepting no conclusions based on assumption, and subjecting all knowledge to the analysis of individual thought processes. These were the principles he applied to his brilliant works of philosophy. The most important of those works were Discourse on Method, Meditations, and Principles of Philosophy. Meditations was Descartes' favorite and is considered his masterpiece. There are many ideas and methods associated with Descartes' work that have had a profound effect on the development of philosophy since the mid-17th century. Here are some of the most important. First of all, Descartes believed that to arrive at the truth, individuals must first rid themselves of all their past education and beliefs. In this way, they can eliminate all the mistakes and prejudices accumulated since childhood. Every idea and belief we've previously held should be considered with doubt. Secondly, Descartes believed that arrival at the truth required an orderly, methodical thinking process. No hasty generalizations and conclusions could be allowed. People must proceed carefully from simple, concrete, known objects up to the more abstract. The mind, therefore, is the instrument for discovering truth, and the starting point for all philosophical thought. 3. The purpose of philosophy is to analyze the content of human thought, the subject and conclusions. Every idea should be reduced to its basic elements one by one. 4. Descartes believed in the existence of God and felt that his own questioning and imaginings of God were proof God existed. He saw it this way. He is seeking perfection, yet perfection doesn't exist in his mind. Therefore, the idea of perfection must have been put there by a perfect creator. And if God is perfect, he cannot deceive. So it follows that perfection, or knowledge of truth, can be attained, and it can be attained through the rational mind. 5. Descartes believed man possesses a soul, which is spiritual and is united to the material body. The soul interacts with the body in the conduct of its business. Therefore, soul and body are separate but related. 6. Will and reason are properties of the soul. The body, on the other hand, has desires and needs of its own. Morality is the ability of a man to subject his passions to the will and reason of the soul. It was these ideas and others that made a deep impact on the history of philosophy. Every philosopher who followed Descartes was in some way indebted to him. He is considered the most influential philosopher before Immanuel Kant, who appeared on the scene 100 years later. One of the reasons for this is that Descartes broke away from traditional scholasticism. Scholasticism was the very systematic philosophy developed by medieval scholars between the 10th and 15th century that was based on Aristotle's work and the work of early Christian writers. It relied heavily on, in fact insisted on, traditional doctrines. Descartes instead preferred the use of science and reason in attaining his truths. When Descartes broke from scholasticism, he paved the way for future philosophers to explore new and freer ways of thinking. That is why the work of Rene Descartes is often considered the first modern system of philosophical thought. Discourse on Method was written in 1637, when Descartes was 41 years old. It's considered the first great philosophical work written in French, and its style became a model for all the future work that followed in that country. 4 years later, when he was 45, Descartes published Meditations on the First Philosophy, popularly known simply as Meditations. He took the novel approach of including in the book the objections of other philosophers and theologians to whom he'd first submitted the work. Then he included his responses to their objections. Meditations is the most important of Descartes' works because it contains his complete theories on metaphysics and what is called epistemology. Epistemology is the investigation of human knowledge, including its nature, limits, and criteria. In Meditations, Descartes considers the sources of knowledge, the validity of truth, the destiny of man, the existence of God, and the creation of the universe. In short, he takes on the most monumental questions of the human experience. Descartes began his work by doubting everything, but to him, this very doubt was the evidence for what he searched. The existence of a doubt implied the existence of something that was doubting. Hence, he, the doubter, existed. He expressed that in the Latin phrase, cogito ergo sum, or as we know it, I think, therefore I am. There are 6 meditations in the book on 6 different but related subjects. In the first one, Descartes explains the reasons for his doubts about methods used to arrive at truth. The second meditation, which is really the beginning of the important part of the book, describes the human mind. The third meditation is Descartes' famous argument for the existence of God. The fourth describes errors in methods of thought and requirements for truths. The fifth talks about the essence of man's physical nature and body. And the sixth and final meditation addresses differences between the soul and the body. In the preface of Meditations, Descartes responds to the criticism of his previous book, The Discourse, and says he's continuing with the quest he began in that book to meditate seriously on the important questions of God and the human soul. He advises his readers to try and detach themselves from prejudices and information they've gained through their 5 senses, so they can realize the maximum benefit of the meditations that follow. It is Meditation 3 that contains his renowned argument for the existence of God. In his mind is an idea of a perfect God. It's a clear and distinct idea. Clear ideas are true. Because this idea is true, he can proceed with an analysis of perfection. A thing can't be perfect if it's merely imagined in his mind. A perfect object must exist to be perfect. Therefore, the idea of a perfect God necessarily includes existence. Meditations was a work that helped establish an entirely new approach to knowledgeable thought and investigation, which influenced not just philosophy, but science and mathematics. Perhaps his greatest contribution to these new methods was the idea he put forth at the very beginning of his meditations, the idea of doubt, or, as he puts it, universal doubt. It was this encouragement to doubt all we've previously learned and believed, particularly if it was based on the perception of our senses alone, that freed people to give up their prejudices and conventional ideas to pursue a more real and workable truth. Descartes put his confidence instead in intuitive knowledge, those ideas that come to us with clarity and distinctness and which do not proceed from our sensation of an external reality. Such clear ideas stimulate the will to accept them as true. Existence is something that's intuited. It's apprehended immediately by an active intellect and is therefore real. This includes his own existence as well as the existence of God. It was the method of thought Descartes used to arrive at his conclusions that so affected his contemporaries and future philosophers. First, he doubts the truth of all he's learned before. Second, he finds one certain principle upon which to rationally build all his following conclusions. For him, that principle is, I think, therefore I am. This he knew by direct intuition. It was a clear and distinct idea, and his will acted upon it to make it true. From that one fixed, absolute point, he was able to establish for himself a series of related, cumulative truths that spiraled upward and upward until he had his personal evidence for the existence of God. For some people, this evidence was convincing. For others, it was faulty, even sacrilegious. But the meticulous method and logic he created was to have a profound impact on many disciplines and was the foundation of modern philosophy. When Descartes was born, philosophy had been standing in the same place for almost 2,000 years. It was he who helped ignite the flame of knowledge that had been all but extinguished since the time of the ancient Greeks. He challenged his contemporaries to think for themselves, to ask questions, to not rely on past opinions and theories, but to use their own minds and reason to attain their own truths. His theories and methods, as creative and intelligent as they are only part of his contribution. His real contribution was in inspiring society to think again, to resume its learning, and to continue on a search that had been abandoned before the goal had been attained.
This is the end of the session.